Hey fam, good to see you back. Before we dive into today's mystery, Sherlock Holmes and the disappearance on Blackfriar's Bridge, I want to know, what's something that made you smile today? And where in the world are you listening from? I'll be sharing a few of your shout-outs next time, so don't be shy. All right, get comfy, maybe grab a cup of tea. Let's get into it, because around here, things are never quite what they seem. Chapter 1. The vanishing in the fog-it was in the melancholy twilight of a wet October evening that I found myself once more ensconced in the familiar armchair across from Sherlock Holmes at 201B Baker Street. A fire crackled cheerily in the hearth, casting long, restless shadows along the walls, while outside the rain drummed a steady tattoo upon the window panes. Holmes, for his part, lounged in his dressing gown, eyes half closed, a thin wreath of smoke from his pipe curling languidly toward the ceiling. Our silence was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Mrs. Hudson, who, after a modest knock, entered, bearing a telegram upon a silver tray. Holmes accepted it with a languid hand, opened it with a flick of his slender fingers, and scanned its contents with a sharpening of his features. "A most curious affair, Watson," he murmured, handing me the slip of paper. "It appears that we are summoned at once to Blackfriar's Bridge." I took the telegram and read, "Urgent. Disappearance on Blackfriar's Bridge. Man vanished in Broadview. Scotland Yard baffled. Please come. Inspector Lestrade." I looked up in astonishment. Vanished? In Broadview? Holmes swung his legs off the sofa and reached for his boots with an energy that belied his former indolence. "It is rare, my dear Watson, for Lestrade to admit bafflement so freely. That alone renders this case worth our immediate attention." Within moments we were rattling through the slick London streets in a cab, the gas lamps casting blurred halos through the misty gloom. Holmes was unusually quiet, his hawk-like profile illuminated intermittently by passing lights. I knew better than to disturb him when he was thus engaged in silent reflection. As we approached Blackfriar's Bridge, a knot of curious onlookers had gathered at the entrance, their faces pale and peering through the shifting fog. Lestrade, recognizable even in the mist by his short stature and bowler hat, strode forward to meet us. "Thank heavens you're here, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said briskly. "Never seen anything like it. One moment the man's walking across the bridge, next he's gone, vanished like a puff of smoke." Holmes's eyes glittered with interest. Who was the unfortunate gentleman? "Name of Mr. Harold Blythe," Lestrade replied. "A solicitor, respectable enough. Left his chambers in Temple Bar around 6:30, bound for a dinner engagement in Southwark. Several witnesses saw him walking across the bridge. Then, just before reaching the south end, poof! He was nowhere to be found. Any disturbances? Sounds? Cries for help?" Holmes asked sharply. "None, sir. Quiet as the grave." Holmes steepled his fingers under his chin and gazed out into the mist. "And where precisely was he last seen?" Lestrade led us a few yards onto the Bouet Bridge. "Here, right about this spot. You see, there's a break in the railings. Maintenance, they said. Could be he fell into the river." Holmes knelt to examine the stone paving. I watched as he ran his fingertips lightly over the damp surface, eyes half shut in concentration. "No scuff marks, no struggle," he murmured, "and the break in the railing would indeed permit a fall. Yet why no splash heard? Why has nobody recovered thus far? He rose and turned to Lestrade. I presume you have sent men to search the river. 12, sir, dragging the water already. Nothing yet. Holmes's mouth twisted into a faint, sardonic smile. Then it is not so simple as a mere accident. Mark that, Watson. Not so simple by half. Lestrade looked harassed. There's more. This way, if you please. We followed him to a nearby constable who was standing guard over a curious object propped against the parapet. It was a walking stick, polished mahogany with a silver handle, intricately engraved with the initials HB. Found it leaning against the bridge rail, Lestrade said grimly. Matches the description given by his clerk. Holmes plucked it up and examined it minutely. His nostrils flared slightly. Still faintly warm to the touch, he said, more to himself than to us. Recently handled, yet abandoned so neatly, so obviously, as if intended to be found. He rapped the silver handle thoughtfully against the stone. Tell me, Lestrade, was the most particularly thick when Mr. Blythe had disappeared? Yes, sir, thick as pea soup. Holmes nodded. Then we must proceed upon 2 assumptions. 1, that the mist offered cover. 2, that Mr. Blythe was either removed against his will or made to vanish willingly. And you think? I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity. Holmes smiled thinly. I think, Watson, that we are standing at the threshold of a case most singular. Singular enough, perhaps, to tax even the modest powers of your humble servant. He turned abruptly. Come, let us examine the full length of the bridge. And, Watson, keep your eyes open for what is not there, as much as for what is. Thus began our night amidst the swirling fog and ancient stones, a night that would lead us through deception, false leads, and hidden dangers, before at last revealing a truth more startling than either of us could have anticipated. Chapter 2. The Solicitor's Secret. The hansom cab carried us southward across the river, its wheels hissing over the slick cobblestones. Holmes sat taut and silent, his sharp profile etched against the shifting fog beyond the glass. I had seen that particular gleam in his eyes before, a keen anticipation, like a hound scenting a hidden quarry. I said nothing, content to let him marshal his formidable faculties without interruption. Our first stop was Mr. Harold Blythe's chambers at Temple Bar, an austere set of rooms tucked away behind a stone archway. We found them already under the watchful eye of a uniformed constable, who admitted us after a word from Lestrade. Inside, the rooms were as one might expect of a respectable solicitor, orderly, well-appointed, but curiously impersonal. A heavy oak desk occupied the centre of the main office, its surface neatly arranged with ledgers, correspondence, and an inkwell. A faint scent of pipe tobacco lingered in the air. Holmes moved swiftly but methodically about the room, pausing, here to scrutinize a paperweight, there to lift a sheaf of letters. He examined the spines of the law books lining the shelves, tapped lightly upon the floorboards, and even went so far as to check the wastepaper basket, which yielded nothing more interesting than a torn envelope and an old newspaper. Orderly, methodical, but little of the man himself, he muttered. Tell me, Lestrade, have you interviewed his clerk? Lestrade gestured toward the adjoining room, where a pale young man in spectacles sat stiffly upon a hard-backed chair, wringing his hands. Name's Albert Simmons, been with Blythe for 2 years, swears he knows nothing. Holmes approached the clerk with that sudden hawk-like energy that so often unsettled the unprepared. "You were the last to see Mr. Blythe before he left this evening?" he asked crisply. "Yes, sir," stammered Simmons. "He said he was dining with a Mr. Charles Hargreave at the Golden Hind Tavern in Southwark. He seemed quite himself, calm, I mean, in good spirits." "Has he received any unusual correspondence today?" Simmons blinked. "Not that I know of, sir. Only the usual. A few bills, some legal queries. He dictated 2 letters before leaving." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "May I see them?" Simmons hurried to the desk and produced copies from the correspondence ledger. Holmes perused them with a frown. Both quite ordinary. One concerning the settlement of an estate, the other a minor property dispute. He handed them back. No hint of anxiety, threat, or hasty arrangements. Holmes turned on his heel and paced the office, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "No wife or family?" "None, sir," said Lestrade. "Blythe lived alone. No hint of trouble either, socially or financially." Holmes halted before a cabinet and opened it, revealing rows of case files neatly labelled and stored. His eyes flicked rapidly over the tabs before he selected one marked Peregrine Trust, Vs. Elwood. He murmured. "Recently. Filed 2 days ago." He flipped through the file, lips pursed in thought. I peered over his shoulder, but saw nothing unusual. Only the dry particulars of a trust dispute between 2 minor gentry families of Surrey. Holmes replaced the file and shut the cabinet with a snap. "We must not allow the surface calm to deceive us," he said softly. "Often the greatest storms brew beneath the stillest waters." We departed shortly after, with Holmes deep in thought and Lestrade muttering about the senselessness of it all. Back in the cab, Holmes remained silent until we had crossed again into the broader arteries of the city. "Watson," he said suddenly, "did you note the clerk's hands?" I shook my head. "Beyond their trembling, no." "Exactly. The young man was terrified, yet not of us. Fear rooted deeper than mere official inquiry. And yet he dared not speak openly. You suspect he knows more than he admitted?" "I suspect he knows something he believes is dangerous to confess. It is a delicate position, Watson, to know a secret and to fear its telling more than its keeping." We rattled onward through the fog, the gas lamps glowing like dim stars through the murk. "And what of the trust case?" I asked after a moment. Holmes tapped his long fingers against the window. "Peregrine Trust vs. Elwood. A petty case on its surface. Yet I find the coincidence of its freshness and the sudden disappearance of its solicitor troubling." He smiled thinly. "We are like men walking into a maze, Watson. Each step seems simple, but the walls close in unseen. Tomorrow we shall call upon Mr. Charles Hargreave, and perhaps we shall find that the disappearance of Mr. Blythe is but the first ripple of a deeper disturbance." As the cab turned toward Baker Street, the mist swallowed the city behind us, leaving only questions drifting like smoke in the night. Chapter 3. The Man at the Golden Hind. The following morning, Holmes and I breakfasted with unusual speed. Holmes consumed only a single cup of coffee, and a piece of dry toast, an unmistakable sign that the case had taken full possession of his restless mind. No sooner had I set down my cup than he sprang to his feet and reached for his coat. "We must waste no time, Watson," he said. "The truth grows no fatter for being left unattended." The fog of the previous evening had lifted somewhat, revealing a London washed clean by the night's persistent rain. We made our way to Southwark, the streets bustling with early traffic, until we reached the Golden Hind Tavern, a low, sprawling establishment with a swinging sign depicting an ancient galleon in full sail. Inside, the tavern proved to be surprisingly respectable, with polished wood floors, brass fittings, and the smell of strong ale lingering in the air. A few early patrons lingered over their breakfasts, but it was to the innkeeper that Holmes addressed himself. "Mr. Charles Hargreave," he said with that commanding directness he so often employed. "Is he known to you?" The innkeeper, a round-faced man with keen blue eyes, nodded at once. "Aye, sir. Regular customer. Arranged to meet Mr. Blythe here last night, he did." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And did they meet?" The innkeeper's brow furrowed. "No, sir. Mr. Hargreave was here by 7, asked after Mr. Blythe once or twice, but eventually gave up and left. Looked right, he did." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "May we speak with him?" The man wiped his hands on his apron. "Mr. Hargreave keeps rooms just round the corner, sir. Number 12, Pemberton Street." Holmes thanked him, and we made our way out once more into the damp morning. Pemberton Street proved to be a narrow, slightly disreputable lane lined with lodging-houses. At number 12, a slatternly maid directed us to the first-floor sitting-room, where a thin man in his early 40s rose nervously to greet us. Charles Hargreave was sallow of complexion, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that darted continually toward the window, as though he expected danger to come creeping through the mist. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson," Holmes said briskly. "You were to dine with Mr. Harold Blythe last night?" "Yes," Hargreave replied, his voice strained. "But he never came. I waited nearly an hour." "Was that arrangement made recently?" "Yesterday morning. He sent round a note proposing the meeting. Said he had matters of great importance to discuss." Holmes' expression sharpened. "What sort of matters?" "I have no idea," Hargreave said earnestly. "We are acquaintances, nothing more. We both belong to the same chess club." Holmes regarded him with an unreadable expression. "And you have had no dealings with Mr. Blythe of a financial or professional nature?" "None whatsoever," Hargreave replied firmly. "We spoke of books, chess, politics, but no business." Holmes turned and paced the small room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Yet you found his request for a private meeting unremarkable?" Hargreave hesitated. "Well, yes and no. Blythe was not a man much given to social calls. I assumed it must be something confidential, but certainly not dangerous." Holmes stopped and fixed him with a piercing gaze. "You noticed nothing unusual in his behaviour the last time you saw him?" "Nothing," Hargreave said quickly. "Though, now that I think about it, he did seem distracted, absent-minded." Holmes nodded slightly, as if some private expectation had been confirmed. "One last question, Mr. Hargreave. Did you notice anyone paying particular attention to Mr. Blythe at the club or elsewhere?" Hargreave frowned. "No, unless you count Mr. Catamole. And who is Mr. Catamole? A businessman. Recently joined the club. He was rather eager to engage Blythe in conversation about something. I assumed it was legal advice, but Blythe seemed to avoid him. Holmes smiled thinly. I thank you for your time. Good day to you. We left Mr. Hargreaves stood uncertainty at his door and made our way back toward the main road. A new name enters our little drama, I said. Indeed, Holmes replied. Mr. Catamole, a man whose interest in our missing solicitor was not, I think, purely social. We must discover who he is, Watson, and swiftly. Time presses. I fear our Mr. Blythe may be beyond the reach of help if we delay much longer. Nietzsche. Morning fog began to gather once more, as we hailed another hansom cab. The city's blurred outlines sliding past us like phantoms, as we sped toward a new and more shadowed corner of the puzzle. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Mr. Catamole. We found ourselves once more amid the twisting alleys and bustling markets of Southwark, that quarter of London where anonymity came cheap and suspicion hung as heavy as the river fog. Holmes directed the cab towards the nearest office of public records, a grim stone building where the affairs of London's citizens lay preserved in yellowing ledgers and brittle papers. Inside, Holmes set to work with the feverish precision that always overcame him when scenting the trail. Within an hour, his search bore fruit. He tapped the page before him with a long forefinger. Here we are, Watson. Catamole, Percival Augustus, merchant. Late of Birmingham, relocated to London 6 months past. Minor dealings in shipping and bonds. No known criminal record, but note this. I leaned closer. Beneath the bland biographical details, Holmes had underlined a single terse entry. Subject of an unresolved inquiry regarding the disappearance of assets from Blenheim Shipping Company. Suspected but not charged, Holmes mused. The best camouflage for a man of careful villainy. From the records office, we made our way to the Anglo-Oriental Chess Club, an establishment tucked discreetly into a side street off Fleet Street. The interior was dark and polished, with thick carpets to muffle footsteps, and a subdued atmosphere more suited to a cathedral than a gathering place for games of strategy. The steward, a stoop-shouldered man in a black waistcoat, greeted us warily. Holmes produced one of his visiting cards and murmured a few words. The steward's manner thawed at once. Yes, sir. Mr. Catamole is a new member. Comes most evenings. Quiet fellow. Mostly keeps to himself. Would he be here now? Holmes asked. Not yet, sir, but likely soon. He has a reserved table near the back. Holmes smiled in a way I had come to recognize. A thin, anticipatory curve of the lips that heralded imminent action. Very good. We shall wait. We settled ourselves near a corner, Holmes occupying himself with a battered chess manual, while his sharp eyes flicked up to scan each new arrival. Time passed slowly in the muffled gloom. At last, a thick-set man with close-cropped hair and heavy jowls entered, removing his gloves with a deliberateness that suggested both caution and calculation. The steward approached and greeted him softly. "Good evening, Mr. Catamole. Your usual table is ready." The man nodded curtly and made his way to the rear. Holmes rose smoothly to his feet. "Come, Watson," he said under his breath. "The spider approaches his web." We crossed to Catamole's table. Holmes addressed him with the easy politeness that always masked his keenest intentions. "Mr. Cattermole, I believe, may I have a word?" The man's small, suspicious eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Merely an investigator with a professional interest," Holmes said smoothly. "Concerning a mutual acquaintance, Mr. Harold Blythe." For a fraction of a second, something flared in Cattermole's gaze. Fear, perhaps, or calculation, before he composed himself. "I know him slightly," he said. "Played a few games of chess. Nothing more." Holmes smiled disarmingly. "Of course, no impropriety suggested, and yet you sought his company rather persistently, did you not?" Cattermole shifted in his seat. "I had a business proposition, nothing of consequence." "And yet now he has disappeared." Cattermole's face darkened. "That's got nothing to do with me." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "On the contrary, Mr. Cattermole, I believe it has everything to do with you." There was a long pause, broken only by the soft clack of chess pieces from a nearby game. Cattermole rose abruptly. "I've no more to say," he muttered. "Good evening, gentlemen." Without waiting for a reply, he strode toward the door. Holmes made no move to stop him, merely watching with that peculiar calculating detachment I knew so well. When the door had closed behind the man, Holmes turned to me. "Did you notice it, Watson?" "His manner? Yes, and more. A bulge at his coat pocket, something cylindrical, and his left cuff stained faintly with river mud." "You believe he was on Blackfriar's Bridge?" "I believe he was somewhere near it last night, and if my instincts are correct, he holds a piece of this puzzle clutched in his thick fingers." Outside, the mist was closing in again, swirling around the gaslights like a living thing. Holmes stood for a moment, gazing into the shifting fog with a rapt expression. "The pieces are moving, Watson. Already the board begins to show its pattern. But whether we play the winning move or are checkmated ourselves remains to be seen." Chapter 5. The Hidden Hand. The fog grew heavier as we stepped out of the Anglo-Oriental Chess Club, swallowing the narrow street in a damp embrace. Holmes pulled his collar up against the chill and motioned me toward a waiting cab. "Follow him," he said tersely to the driver, nodding in the direction where Cattermole had disappeared. "And at a distance." The cab rolled forward cautiously, its wheels barely making a sound on the wet stones. We glimpsed Cattermole ahead, his stout frame cutting a purposeful path through the mist. He moved with the wary speed of a man conscious of being pursued yet too proud to admit fear. For nearly a quarter of an hour, we tailed him through the labyrinth of alleys and market streets. At last he turned into a narrow mews and disappeared into a doorway marked with peeling paint. G. Lambert and Cove shipping agents. Holmes tapped the roof of the cab. "Wait here, Watson." Before I could protest, he was gone, melting into the shadows, with that cat-like stealth that never ceased to astonish me. I waited anxiously, the minutes crawling past with glacial slowness. At last, Holmes reappeared, his face grave. "He's meeting someone," he said shortly as he climbed in. "A lean man, dark of hair and complexion. I could not catch much, but 2 words were exchanged clearly enough. Tonight and shipment." "Shipment?" I echoed. Holmes nodded. "It suggests that the matter is not yet concluded. On the contrary, it is moving towards some final act, and I Fear that Mr. Blythe's fate may be bound up with it." He tapped thoughtfully on the side of the cab with his fingertips. "The mention of a shipment connects neatly to Cattermole's prior activities. The missing assets from Blenheim Shipping, you recall. I believe we are looking at a scheme far larger than a simple disappearance." We returned to Baker Street to regroup. Holmes, restless as a confined hawk, spent the afternoon writing letters and dispatching messengers to various quarters of the city. I occupied myself with my medical journals, though my mind remained firmly fixed upon the mystery unfolding around us. As evening fell, Holmes received a thin packet by special messenger. He tore it open eagerly and scanned the contents. "Excellent!" he exclaimed. "Watson, we have confirmation. G. Lambert & Co. is a sham, registered only a fortnight ago to a fictitious proprietor. It exists solely for the purpose of one transaction, a private shipment leaving London by riverboat tonight." "Riverboat?" I repeated. "Bound where?" "To the coast first, then abroad. Details are sparse. The shipment is described merely as secured cargo. No further explanation given." Holmes's eyes gleamed with an intensity I had seldom seen surpassed. "It is tonight or never, Watson. We must intercept that shipment, or bid farewell to the truth behind Mr. Blythe's disappearance." He glanced at the clock. 8 o'clock. If they move at high tide, we have little time. Within minutes we were once again rattling through the murky streets, Holmes directing the cab toward the wharves beyond, Blackfriar's Bridge. The mist was thicker than ever, clinging to the cobbles and muffling every sound. Shapes loomed out of the fog. Crates, barrels, the hunched forms of dockworkers going about their grim business. Holmes pulled me aside into the shadows as we reached a crumbling warehouse near the water's edge. A lantern swung above the entrance, its feeble light barely penetrating the gloom. "There," he whispered, pointing. Through the mist, we could see Cattermole and the dark-haired man Holmes had described earlier. They were supervising the loading of a large iron-bound crate onto a flat riverboat moored to a decaying pier. Several rough-looking men moved about, their low voices muffled by the fog. Holmes's hand closed on my arm. "Observe carefully, Watson. That crate may well contain the key to our entire mystery." We edged closer, using a stack of barrels for cover. From our new vantage, we could see the markings on the crate. No company insignia, no shipping destination. It was as anonymous as death itself. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he watched the men lash the crate to the boat's deck. "They are nearly ready to depart," he murmured. "We must act quickly." "But how?" I whispered. Holmes smiled thinly. "I have a plan, Watson, one requiring both courage and a certain disregard for propriety." He crouched beside me, outlining his scheme in swift, urgent tones. As I listened, the cold dampness of the night seemed to sink deeper into my bones, and I realized that whatever lay ahead, it would demand all the nerve we possessed. Chapter 6. The River's Secret Holmes's plan, though simple in essence, carried no small amount of personal risk. We would wait until the boat pushed off, then board it under cover of the thick mist, with Holmes relying on his exceptional agility and my less graceful but sufficiently willing cooperation. Once aboard, we would search the mysterious crate before it could slip away into the dark labyrinth of the Thames. At a subtle signal from Holmes, we crept down the slippery stones toward the pier. The faint creaking of wood and the low mutter of voices guided us. Just as the boatman untied the last of the mooring ropes, Holmes darted forward, sprang lightly onto the deck, and with a whispered curse at my own clumsiness, I followed. We crouched low among the barrels and supplies near the stern. The riverboat began to move, its shallow draught allowing it to slip almost soundlessly over the inky water. The mist swallowed the world around us. Even the lamplights of the embankment disappeared, leaving us in a murky twilight of swirling vapours and whispered oar-strokes. Holmes tapped my shoulder and gestured toward the crate. Two men stood nearby, their outlines dim in the gloom, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "No delays," one muttered. "He said if the police sniff round, dump it and go." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he caught the words. Carefully, we edged forward, using the shifting shadows to cover our movements. As the men turned to check the boat's heading, Holmes produced a slim knife from within his coat and set to work on the crate's bindings. A few swift motions, and the heavy lid gave a faint groan as it shifted. Holmes lifted it an inch and peered inside. I leaned closer, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Inside, curled awkwardly and unconscious, or worse, was the figure of a man. His coat and trousers were fine but dishevelled, and even by the dim light, I recognized the face from the photograph Lestrade had shown us the night before. It was Harold Blythe. Holmes replaced the lid silently, his expression a mask of grim determination. He touched his lips, signalling me to silence. The riverboat was now slipping past the looming skeletal outlines of dockside cranes. The tide carried us swiftly, and soon we would be beyond the reach of help. Holmes tugged me back into the deeper shadows near the stern and whispered into my ear. "We must signal the police launch. I arranged for a patrol at Blackfriar's Reach." "But how?" I began, only to see him produce a small folded lantern from his coat. It was a signalling lamp, such as those used by naval men. Waiting until the boat passed under a low bridge, Holmes flicked open the lamp's shutters, sending a quick, sharp series of flashes towards the unseen banks. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then, faintly, I heard it. The answering hiss of steam and the rhythmic churning of a patrol launch drawing closer through the mist. The two men on deck stiffened. One let out a low oath. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "Get the crate overboard." At once they rushed toward the box containing Blythe. Holmes was faster. He sprang up, knocking over a barrel with a loud crash to draw their attention. The same instant, the dark water erupted alongside us as the police launch rammed against the riverboat's side, officers swarming aboard. A brief, furious struggle followed. I remember grappling with a man whose breath stank of gin and whose fists swung wildly. Holmes, cool and relentless, dispatched another with a well-placed blow to the jaw. In minutes, it was over. The two ringleaders, Catamol and his confederate, were in handcuffs, snarling curses. The crate was hauled open under Lestrade's anxious supervision, revealing Mr. Blythe, alive, though dazed and badly bruised. Holmes knelt beside him, checking his pulse with a practised hand. "He is alive," he said calmly, "though not long would he have remained so. A few more hours, and the crate and its occupant would have been dumped into the river." Blythe moaned weakly, his eyes fluttering open. Where am I?" "Safe, sir," Holmes said gently. "Rest easy. Your ordeal is over." Lestrade turned to Holmes, bewildered. But why kidnap a solicitor? What was the purpose? Holmes's smile was thin and cryptic. Patience, Lestrade. You have arrested the hand. Now, let us find the mind behind it. Mist closed around us once more as we headed back upriver, the city's lights emerging through the fog like distant stars. I could not help but feel that, though we had snatched Mr. Blythe from the jaws of death, the greater mystery, the why, behind it all, remained coiled in the shadows, waiting to strike again. Chapter 7. Threads in the Dark. We returned to Baker Street in the small hours of the morning, wearied but driven by a restless curiosity. Mr. Blythe had been conveyed to St. Thomas's Hospital under police guard, while Cattermole and his confederate were taken into custody for questioning. The surface of the affair had been breached, but Holmes, ever discontent with partial victories, paced the sitting-room with quick, restless strides, the fire casting giant shadows against the walls. "Watson," he said, pausing abruptly before the hearth, "we have saved Mr. Blythe's life, but we have not yet uncovered the purpose of his abduction. You believe Cattermole was not the principal mover?" "Precisely. He is a tool, an implement without imagination. There is a greater mind at work here, one we have yet to expose." He turned toward the cluttered sideboard and poured himself a measure of brandy, though he scarcely touched it. His mind was far from any earthly indulgence. "Consider," he continued, resuming his pacing, "Blythe was lured under false pretences to Blackfriar's Bridge. He carried no money of note, no compromising documents. Thus, ransom or robbery is unlikely. Revenge, perhaps?" Holmes shook his head. "Unlikely. There is no hint of a personal vendetta. No, Watson, this strikes me as a matter of business, of information." He crossed to his writing desk, where he pulled forth the copy of Peregrine, Trust v. Elwood we had inspected earlier. This trust dispute, it seemed minor, but what if it were not? What if, hidden among the dry legal wrangling, there lies a matter of consequence? One worth silencing Blythe over. He thumbed quickly through the papers, his keen gaze flickering from page to page. "Ah!" he exclaimed suddenly. "Here. A clause, obscure, easily overlooked, transferring water rights along a particular stretch of the Wey River. Nothing remarkable, until one notes the location." He spread a map upon the desk and jabbed a finger at a spot southwest. "Of London, here, Watson, near the village of Melford." I leaned closer, squinting. A rural backwater. What significance could it hold? Holmes's smile was fleeting. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must discover." A knock at the door interrupted our deliberations. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a note upon a silver tray. Holmes opened it, his eyes narrowing as he read. "It is from Lestrade. Cattermole refuses to speak. The other man, a dock worker named Flynn, claims ignorance. But, and this is crucial, Lestrade reports a visitor attempted to see Cattermole tonight before the formal charges were laid. He handed me the note. A gentleman of distinguished appearance, dark overcoat, silver-headed cane, left without giving his name when refused admission." "A conspirator?" I asked. "Undoubtedly. One possessed enough audacity to attempt a visit under the very nose of Scotland Yard." Holmes's mind was clearly racing ahead, piecing invisible patterns together. He tossed aside his brandy untouched and snatched his hat and coat. "Come, Watson. We go to Melford at once. The answers we seek lie buried not here among the city's stones, but out there, among the quiet fields and unseen waters." Within the hour, we were aboard a late-running train, the city's smudged lights receding behind us. Holmes sat rigid and silent, his features sharpened by the shifting shadows of the compartment. I watched him in the flickering lamplight, marvelling once more at the tireless intensity that burned within him. That refusal to leave any thread untraced, any secret unplumbed. The train rocked and rattled onward into the deepening night, carrying us toward Melford, and toward the heart of a mystery that had only begun to show its true and treacherous shape. Chapter 8. The waters of Melford dawn was a pale smudge on the horizon when the train finally pulled into the small station at Melford. The village, still sleeping under a heavy blanket of mist, gave little sign of life as we descended from the carriage and made our way along the muddy lanes. Holmes, his coat buttoned tight against the early chill, set a brisk pace toward the river. The way was a sluggish ribbon of water here, flanked by low meadows and crumbling stone walls. Everything about the landscape spoke of ancient neglect, leaning fences, moss-choked ditches, and cottages that sagged against the ground, as if weary from centuries of standing. Holmes paused on the bridge that spanned the river's narrowest point. He leaned over the parapet, studying the water with a frown. "Observe, Watson," he said. "Note the peculiar discoloration along the banks." I followed his gaze. A faint, greasy sheen marred the otherwise placid surface, spreading in slow, iridescent ripples from a spot further upstream. "A pollution of some kind," I said. "Precisely, and unnatural to this place. This river has been prized for its purity for generations." He turned away abruptly, striding down a narrow footpath that led into a copse of trees. I hurried after him, our footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The path curved sharply, and as we emerged from the trees, we came upon a strange sight. Nestled against the riverbank was a large, low building of recent construction. Its walls were of rough stone, but its roof was fitted with new slates, and the windows were shuttered tight. A narrow lane led from the road to its stout wooden doors, which bore no sign or name. Holmes crouched in the undergrowth, surveying the structure with narrowed eyes. "An unregistered mill," he muttered. "Or so it would appear, yet no smoke rises from the chimney, no sound of wheels or water." He extracted a field glass from his pocket and studied the building minutely. "Note the barrels stacked near the door, industrial in nature, and there, an iron pipe leading from the building into the river." I felt a growing sense of unease. "What can it mean, Holmes?" He lowered the glass. "It means, my dear Watson, that someone has established a clandestine operation here, one requiring secrecy, access to water, and proximity to London." He rose and dusted off his knees. "The rights to this stretch of river were transferred, you recall, by the Peregrine Trust to a shell entity, almost certainly under the influence of our unseen adversary. Blythe, perhaps unknowingly, facilitated the transaction. And when he discovered something irregular, precisely, he became a liability." Holmes's face darkened. "There is more here than smuggled goods or illicit manufacture. I can feel it. The lengths to which these men have gone, the calculated abduction, the attempted murder, bespeak a far greater prize than mere financial gain. We withdrew into the woods and circled the mill cautiously. At the rear, we found a smaller door, secured by a heavy chain and padlock. Holmes examined it closely, then produced a small set of lockpicks from his coat, a device he carried for just such contingencies. Within moments the lock yielded with a faint click. Holmes pushed the door open just wide enough for us to slip inside. The interior was cold and damp, the air reeking of oil and chemicals. Crates were stacked against, the walls labelled in ciphered markings. A massive boiler stood silent at the far end, its flues clogged with soot. Holmes moved swiftly among the shadows, inspecting the contents of the crates. He pried one open with his knife and revealed its contents. A cache of weapons, rifles, pistols and ammunition packed in straw and oilcloth. "A munitions depot," I breathed. Holmes nodded grimly. Smuggled from abroad, no doubt, and intended for sale to whoever could pay the highest price, an enterprise of staggering illegality and immense profit. He turned to me, his eyes alight. Now we see why Harold Blythe became a target. A solicitor of upright conscience, stumbling upon such a monstrous operation, he could not be allowed to speak. A faint sound reaches our ears, the creak of a board, the scrape of a boot. Holmes raised a hand in warning and drew his revolver from his coat. "We are not alone, Watson." We withdrew into the deeper shadows as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, the murmur of rough voices echoing through the cavernous space. It seemed that the true masters of the scheme had come to inspect their dark harvest, and that our own reckoning was close at hand. Chapter 9. Face to Face. The footsteps drew closer, two sets distinct against the warped wooden floorboards. Holmes and I crouched behind a stack of crates, scarcely daring to breathe. Through a narrow gap between the boards, I glimpsed the intruders, a tall man in a heavy overcoat and a shorter figure carrying a lantern that threw long, wavering shadows across the walls. Their conversation, though low, carried clearly enough in the cavernous hush of the building. "Shipment delayed," the taller man said, his voice clipped and authoritative. "The river incident forced us to alter the plan." "And the solicitor?" asked the shorter man anxiously. "Secured for now, but questions are stirring. Scotland Yard. Snoops about. We must clear this place within 2 nights, or it will be lost to us." Holmes's eyes glittered in the dimness. He leaned close to me and whispered with barely a movement of his lips. "The taller man. He matches the description of the visitor to Scotland Yard." "Then he is the mastermind?" "Almost certainly." Holmes drew a scrap of paper from his pocket and scribbled a swift message. "Take this," he murmured, pressing it into my hand. "Slip out the way we came. Find the village constable, or failing that, telegraph Lestrade from the station." "We need reinforcements." I hesitated. "And you?" "I shall remain. The hawk does not abandon the dovecote when the fox circles." Understanding the peril in delay, I crept back along the wall, heart pounding, and slipped silently through the rear door into the mist-shrouded woods. The trees swallowed me at once, their branches whispering like ghostly sentinels. Behind me, the mill loomed dark and watchful. and somewhere within its depths, Holmes stalked the architects of the entire affair. The path to the village was rough and ill-kept. I stumbled more than once, cursing the uneven ground, but the fear that Holmes might face overwhelming odds drove me onward. At last a cluster of lights emerged ahead. The Melford station, small and shuttered at this early hour. I hammered on the door until a sleepy porter appeared, grumbling and rubbing his eyes. A few sharp words, and the promise of police business brought him to attention. Within minutes he was dispatching a wire to Lestrade, following Holmes's terse instructions. Relieved but still anxious, I retraced my steps toward the mill. The mist seemed thicker now, the river whispering darkly at my side. As I neared the clearing, the low murmur of voices reached my ears once again, this time more urgent, tinged with anger. Creeping to the edge of the clearing, I saw that Holmes had revealed himself. He stood, cool and composed, before the two men, his revolver steady in his hand. "You will remain precisely where you are," he said, his voice slicing through the gloom. "I regret disturbing your commerce, gentlemen, but your activities are at an end." The tall man laughed coldly. "You have no idea what you meddle with, Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I have a very clear idea. Smuggling arms along the way, concealing your operation beneath the veil of a trust dispute. Ingenious, yet not ingenious enough." The shorter man shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door, but Holmes's revolver tracked his movement unerringly. "You are trapped," Holmes said. "Best you make peace with that fact." Even as he spoke, a fresh sound broke through the mist. The pounding of hooves, the clatter of wheels, and the sharp bark of police whistles. Lanterns flared at the edge of the woods as Lestrade and a dozen constables descended upon the mill. The tall man's composure broke. With a snarl, he lunged at Holmes, a knife flashing from his coat. Holmes fired once into the air, a warning shot, and sidestepped neatly, sending the man sprawling into the dirt. Within moments, both conspirators were in handcuffs, cursing and struggling as the constables secured them. Holmes dusted off his coat with a faint smile. "Late, Lestrade, but welcome nevertheless." Lestrade, puffing and red-faced, surveyed the crates with widening eyes. "Good Lord, smuggled weapons? Here?" Holmes nodded. Concealed beneath the pleasant fiction of a rural trust dispute, a network most cleverly arranged, and now most thoroughly undone. The mist curled thick around us as the dawn broke fully over the river, a sickly pale light revealing the decaying building, the broken scheme, and the silent, grim figures who had thought to make fortune from war and secrecy. Holmes turned to me with that rare, fleeting gleam of satisfaction that his greatest cases stirred. "Come, Watson, let us leave the authorities to their work. We have our answers, and Mr. Harold Blythe has his life." We walked away from the scene as the mist began to lift, the world around us returning to its ordinary sunlit form, though the memory of the darkness it had briefly concealed would linger far longer in our minds. Chapter 10. The Web Unravelled. It was 2 days later, in the familiar comfort of Baker Street, that the final threads of the affair were gathered and tied. Holmes sat in his armchair, fingertips pressed together in his characteristic pose of meditation, while I reviewed the notes I had taken during the interviews and statements collected by Scotland Yard. Across from us, Lestrade perched uncomfortably on the edge of the settee, a thick sheaf of documents resting in his lap. "It's all here, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, tapping the papers. "The full extent of it. Arms shipments routed through shadow companies, bribes paid to corrupt dock officials, and more than one solicitor unwittingly caught in the web. Blythe stumbled too close, and they panicked." Holmes gave a slight nod. "The enterprise was a clever one, hidden under layers of legitimate dealings, masked by bureaucratic tedium. Only a mind already attuned to subtle discrepancies would have noticed the faint tremors beneath the surface." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the grey London morning. "Tell me, Lestrade," he said without a turning, "have you identified the tall man?" Lestrade rustled the papers. "Name of Arthur Swithin, former officer, cashiered under suspicion of illegal trafficking, set up Lambert & Co's as a front for his operations. And the shorter man, Thomas Flynn, a dock thief turned enforcer." Holmes's mouth curved into a thin line. Swithin possessed the organisational cunning, Flynn the necessary brutality. A most unholy alliance. He turned back toward us. Yet it was not brute force that nearly succeeded here. It was subtle. The transfer of river rights, a legal fiction few would have questioned. The location, a forgotten village where oversight was lax. It was the perfect confluence of place, opportunity, and ambition. Lestrade shook his head ruefully. "If you hadn't intervened, Holmes, they might have emptied a warehouse full of guns into the wrong hands, and no one the wiser." Holmes inclined his head slightly at the compliment, though I could see the gleam of dry amusement in his eyes. "And Mr. Blythe?" I asked. "Recovering," Lestrade replied. "Poor fellow's shaken, but he'll come through. Said he never realised. The clause he filed could be twisted for such purposes. He thought it was mere land rights." Holmes's face grew momentarily thoughtful. "Such is often the way, Watson. Great evils thrive not in the glare of scandal, but in the shade of ordinary dealings, where a minor clause, an unnoticed signature, may open the floodgates to ruin." He returned to his armchair and relit his pipe, sending thin spirals of smoke curling toward the ceiling. "In the end," he said, "this case reminds us that vigilance must be constant, not only among those charged with law, but among all who traffic in affairs of men. Small cracks, if left unnoticed, may one day bring down the whole house." Lestrade stood gathering his papers. "I'll see to it that the rest of the network is rounded up. Thanks to you, Mr. Holmes, we've got enough to shut it down from end to end." With a nod to both of us, he departed, leaving Holmes and me alone, once more with the crackling fire and the fading mist beyond the window panes. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the warmth of the room seep into my bones. "You were right from the start, Holmes," I said. "It was never simply about a missing man." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "My dear Watson," he said, "when the ordinary vanishes without a trace, it is the extraordinary we must seek beneath it." He drew on his pipe with a satisfied air, and the world beyond Baker Street, for the moment at least, returned to its rightful, orderly course. Chapter 11. Reflections in Baker Street. The days that followed saw the newspapers ablaze with accounts of the Melford discovery. "Sensational arms plot foiled," proclaimed one, while another declared Holmes assists Scotland Yard in unmasking smuggling. Ring. Holmes read these articles with an expression of faint distaste, casting them aside with a flick of his fingers. Always the same, he muttered, the press mistaking the mere surface for the substance. For my part, I welcomed the public recognition, though I knew Holmes derived no real satisfaction from it. His mind, once a case was concluded, rapidly detached itself from all fame and moved hungrily on to the next puzzle. On a bright afternoon some days later, while Holmes was deeply engrossed in a monograph on medieval poisons, a quiet knock at the door announced an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hudson showed in Harold Blythe, looking considerably improved, though a trace of pallor still clung to his features. "My dear Mr. Holmes," Blythe said warmly, extending his hand, "I am in your debt beyond words." Holmes shook his hand briefly. "It was fortunate we intervened when we did, Mr. Blythe. Another night and you would have been beyond even my modest powers of assistance." Blythe seated himself and glanced about the familiar sitting-room with evident relief. "I have given notice at my chambers," he said. "I find the prospect of returning to the law rather distasteful now. I intend to retire to the country, at least for a time." "An understandable decision," Holmes replied. "You have looked too closely into the darker workings of men to regard them now with the same dispassionate eye required of your former profession." Blythe nodded gravely. "Before I leave," he continued, "I wish to ask, how did you unravel it all so swiftly? I confess I scarcely understood the peril even when I stumbled upon that infernal clause." Holmes allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "The clue, Mr. Blythe, was in the absurdity. Your disappearance in a public place, without disturbance or sound, suggested a conspiracy rather than chance. The false trail left by your walking stick, the mist providing cover, the unnatural eagerness of men like Catamole, all pointed not to a crime of passion or profit, but to a deliberate silencing. When we unearthed the Trust's water rights and observed the clandestine mill, the rest followed naturally." Blythe shook his head in wonder. "It is one thing to hear it laid out thus, quite another to imagine following such a faint trail through the fog." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. "The trail is always faint, Mr. Blythe, but the smallest disturbances, the bent blade of grass, the misplaced comma, betray the truth to those who know how to read them." Blythe rose, shook our hands once more, and departed, leaving a small token of gratitude, a silver snuff-box, exquisitely wrought, which Holmes placed without comment on the mantel beside his violin. That evening, as twilight crept once more over Baker Street, Holmes and I sat by the fire, the events of the past week settling into memory. "You know, Holmes," I said, gazing into the flames, "there is something chilling about how easily evil can flourish in places forgotten by the world." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Evil," he said, "requires not the grand theatre we so often imagine, but merely indifference. It thrives best when hidden among the mundane, the overlooked and the dismissed, the mist at Blackfriars, the sleepy meadows of Melford, perfect vales for dark ambition." He stirred the fire with the poker, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. "Yet, so long as there are eyes willing to look beyond the surface," he murmured, "there remains hope." The fire burned low, and for a long time we sat in silence, the faint clatter of distant hooves and the rustle of London's restless night filtering through the windows. Outside, the world continued its slow, indifferent turning. But within 21B, Baker Street, for that evening at least, order had been restored, and the shadows beaten back, if only for a time. Chapter 12. The Final Move. A week after Mr. Blythe's departure to the country, life at Baker Street had settled into its customary rhythm. Holmes, seemingly tireless, flitted from monograph to experiment, while I returned to my quieter duties of practice and record-keeping. Yet, in the quiet hours of the evening, when the fog curled once more against the window panes, my thoughts often drifted back to the case of the Blackfriar's disappearance. One such evening, as I was compiling notes for my account of the affair, Holmes set aside his violin and turned to me with a sudden air of reflection. "You have, no doubt, completed your chronicle of our latest adventure, Watson?" "Nearly," I replied, "though I find myself struggling with how to conclude it. There remains one matter unresolved." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "The matter of motive, Archie," I continued. "We have exposed the smuggling ring, rescued Mr. Blythe, and apprehended the perpetrators. Yet we never fully understood why the operation was concealed so elaborately. Why such desperate measures for a cache of weapons?" Holmes gave a thin smile and leaned back in his chair. "You touch upon the most delicate strand in the web, Watson. A strand which, had it been tugged too vigorously and caught, might have unravelled more than the immediate scheme." He rose and retrieved a thin sheaf of papers from the mantel. "After our return from Melford, I conducted a few discreet inquiries. You recall, perhaps, the name Peregrine Trust?" I nodded. "Nominally a charitable endowment," Holmes said, "but behind it, money from certain political factions on the continent. The goal was not simple profit, but the arming of dissident groups abroad. These men sought not merely wealth, but influence. By supplying weapons quietly, they would have held a dagger at the heart of Europe itself." He tossed the papers onto the side table with a disdainful flick of his wrist. "The plan was audacious, but it depended upon invisibility. Blythe's inadvertent discovery threatened to collapse the house of cards. Hence his abduction and the haste to dispose of him before inquiries could spread." I sat back, feeling a slow chill creep along my spine. "Then we thwarted more than a criminal enterprise," I said. "We may well have prevented a greater conflagration." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Perhaps. It is not always given to us to know the full measure of the consequences we avert." He stood and crossed to the window, peering out into the misty street below. "It is the nature of our profession, Watson. We catch a thread of evil here, a whisper of conspiracy there. Rarely do we see the entire tapestry, but it is enough that we pull the thread, that we expose the whisper to the light." For a moment he remained silent, lost in thought. Then he turned back to me, his expression softening. "You have a gift, my dear fellow, for finding the human heart in these grim affairs. Record it thus, that a man disappeared on Blackfriar's Bridge, not merely because of greed or fear, but because the world itself is made vulnerable by the smallest acts of vigilance or negligence." I closed my notebook slowly. Outside, the lamps of Baker Street burned pale and steady against the fog. Somewhere a carriage rattled past, and the far-off bells of St. Marylebone told the hour. Holmes returned to his chair, reaching for his pipe once more. And so The case of the disappearance on Blackfriar's Bridge passed into the annals of our adventures. One more contest between the hidden machinations of evil and the slender, stubborn light of reason. A contest which, this time at least reason had won.